link it to any specific disclosures. And what I tried to do in my reporting is go back over the indictment and show that, in fact, the most wanted leaks list is connected in the indictment to the war logs, to the cables, and that they're saying that because she saw the list, she's making this disclosure. But I think that's an example of the way the prosecution is trying to use they're altering the meaning of language before the judge as a way to muddy everything and make it possible for them to get Julian Assange to the United States. I want to make a quick point here about what is happening with the UK prosecutors in general. Their goal and what they have to do for the United States is get Julian Assange to U.S. soil. And once we see Julian Assange in U.S. soil, hypothetically, obviously we don't want him to end up in the United States, but once he does get there, if he's there, we're in uncharted territory, and to some degree, what they are making a bones of contention in these proceedings, he may not be able to raise under the Espionage Act in the United States. Well, first off, we've never had a journalist prosecuted under the Espionage Act in the United States. But I will remind people who have some familiarity about whistleblowers that it's a strict liability offense, and Assange would be extremely limited in being able to describe his motivations and his intent when he published these documents. And we don't really know. We haven't heard anything litigated or argued in these proceedings during this week about the First Amendment issue, and I don't know that we will, but it's possible that the carve-out, the way to get around issues, the freedom of speech issues in the United States, is going to be, if we prove that it happened, then that's what we have to do, is just prove that it happened, and then you criminalize the conduct, and it doesn't matter what Julian Assange thinks. And in fact, the best that Julian Assange can do is what Chelsea Manning did, is find some way to get a statement into the court proceedings so that the public can hear from him why he did what he did. But he shouldn't have to explain, because he's a journalist and there should be press freedom.
Yeah, before we do get into the First Amendment in particular and how this case is very serious and will not only impact journalists but impact just average citizens and impact their right to know. I think it's really important when talking about this case. Many people can hear about it and think, oh, I'm not a journalist, this won't impact me. It certainly does. It certainly does. But I want to thank everybody who's watching right now. Thank you for watching us. We just started to do this podcast because we are covering the Assange extradition hearings in London. And then also make sure you do retweet the link so we could get more people watching this, so we can expose more people to this information. We know that oftentimes this is not discussed in corporate media. It is more so now, but we're really getting into depth here. And I'm with people right now who are in the courtroom, so they know firsthand exactly what happened. I would like to get maybe some of your thoughts in here as well with the First Amendment and the assault on the free press that is at stake here.
I could just say a little bit more about what Kevin was talking about, the fact that defendants under the Espionage Act are not allowed to present any public interest defense or explain their motives. Meanwhile, the government gets to say whatever they want about the motives on the other hand. So they get to paint Manning and especially Assange over these last couple of days as someone with really reckless disregard for what will happen if he publishes this information. And so we haven't talked about it that much yet, but that was a big focus of yesterday's hearing as well, was the so in 2010, November of 2010, WikiLeaks began releasing Cablegate, the State Department cables. 250,000 of them, but it just began. It didn't release all of them. It was working with a series of media partners to, in a very specifically, Julian Assange has said, is a harm minimization process. WikiLeaks even would work with these organizations to redact information, even using a script to automatically, like robotically, redact all names just to protect sources who could potentially be named. But then in fast forward to September 2011, and this is how the government would have it. Doesn't really matter what happens in between. Is that just fast forward September 2011, WikiLeaks publishes the unredacted file of all 250,000 cables. But what happens in between is incredibly important. And as you were saying, the selectivity here is really dangerous and super misrepresenting of the facts. What actually happened was, as we talked about in court, so one of the media partners WikiLeaks was working with in 2010 was The Guardian. And David Lee and Luke Harding worked with WikiLeaks on those 2010 disclosures, and together wrote a book that was published in February 2011. So they're making money themselves personally off of these leaks. And we learned that one of the chapter titles of that book was the password to an encrypted file that had all of the unredacted cables. And they put that password on the chapter title of the book, published the book with no double checking of, oh, maybe I should check that password won't release 250,000 cables.
Can I just quickly say, it was a very interesting moment in court, actually, because when that came up, the prosecution lawyer didn't even know that was the case.
Did not know that, and the defense showed him the book, and he kind of was incredulous. He was like, what, really?
Because that's been public knowledge for people that have followed this, but I thought that was a really extraordinary moment. But sorry.
No, so February 2011 was when that book was published, that password was published. Luckily, people didn't put it two and two together for a while. It was kind of a complicated way to figure out how that password should be used. But in August 2011, somebody did figure that out and made that known to WikiLeaks and to others. And others began mirroring WikiLeaks site and posting the unredacted cables. As soon as WikiLeaks found out, as soon as Assange found out, they sprang right into action, warning people about this. And Julian Assange himself called the White House, and Sarah Harrison called the State Department, working for WikiLeaks, called the State Department, saying, like, this is an emergency. Assange specifically said, lives are at risk here. And he was told that he had the emergency line to the White House, to the U.S. government, and then was told, well, just call back in a couple hours, and we'll get to it. And he said he was incredulous himself, saying, like, I don't understand why you don't have urgency here. People's lives are at risk. The U.S. government certainly doesn't want that in the record, doesn't want that discussed. But yeah, again, very selective about what they choose to focus on.
And the interesting thing is that not only is all this stuff on the public record and very easily sort of searchable and findable, but this is actually, this whole scene of him calling the State Department and or the White House, and Sarah Harrison doing that is in Laura Poitras's film.
Right, it's on video.
Risk.
Yeah.
So it's you can just watch it on Netflix. It's on Netflix now. Anyone can see it. Like the evidence is so readily available, and the fact that the prosecution was sort of surprised by it, or at least appeared to be surprised by that chronology was kind of.
When that came up in court, I kind of noticed on Twitter some other journalists who had worked with WikiLeaks at the time in 2010 said that they personally attested to Assange's deep caring for minimizing harm. He's cared very seriously about redactions and not putting innocent people's lives at risk, and they were attesting to that on Twitter, live as this was going on.
And I think this is, again, probably not public knowledge to people that follow this, but it was mentioned in the court how the WikiLeaks redaction process was so thorough that it was actually more thorough than some of the Pentagon's own redaction when things had come out through FOIA requests and things of that nature.
Right, yeah, they redacted more than the government did, more than other media organizations did, but that's not what the government wants to focus on.
And I guess in terms of other misconceptions that are worth correcting, is we talked a little bit about the most wanted list. We kind of had a long discussion yesterday of how, what was on that list and what Manning had provided to Assange was completely different. Documents that WikiLeaks had wanted were not received, and vice versa. So I think that's worth.
But more than that, it was not even something that WikiLeaks put out as like, this is exactly what we want. That's why WikiLeaks is called a wiki. It's collaborative. And they invited journalists and human rights defenders and activists, put on this list what you want, what would be really useful for your work, and giving the public better access to what your government is doing. And so it was a collaborative effort. Other people were putting that on. It's not Assange specifically asking for certain documents. It's a collaborative thing. And
just very quickly about the interesting thing about 2 points about the points of omission is that we had a very good point on our discussion on Monday, is that we hear a lot about the amount of harm that Julian Assange allegedly put people in. We never actually have a discussion about the amount of war crimes that were disclosed, or that in relation to one another is a very stark contrast, isn't there? I forgot the other point I was going to make, so I'm going to hand it.
I was very glad.
You saw me kind of reaching for the mic. I just wanted to build off of some of the points that you were making as well. At least in the early days of WikiLeaks, I believe that it had to rely on other media partners, essentially, to get the information out there. Not just collaborators, but also they relied on the media to report on these leaks. And just for everybody who's watching, if you don't already know this, I know many people that follow the case do, but WikiLeaks has a 100% accuracy rate in reporting, and also are very dedicated to source protection and helping whistleblowers. And we have the director of Courage Foundation with us as well, which is a great organization. And I'd like you to talk about that before we wrap up later on. And I talked about the series of events that you guys held in the United States, which were awesome, and maybe there will be some more of them. Yes, I attended 2 of them. They were great. And it was interesting also during these events to hear from people who knew Julian personally, who know him, and who spent quite a bit of time with him, and said that he was a person of high moral integrity. And then that really is reflected in how he and others working for WikiLeaks, other staff members, took the time to make sure that these names were redacted to minimize potential harm.
I was just thinking that one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is that the U.S. government was actually involved in the redaction process, and that was a very strong argument as well. That isn't mentioned a lot. And 2 of the journalists that were involved with the Spiegel at the time, they gave a talk at the Bundestag, at the German parliament, and testified to how strict WikiLeaks was about protecting sources and about the whole redaction process. And actually, John Goetz, who was also mentioned a lot yesterday, he at that time said that how annoyed he and the others were, and that they would talk about WikiLeaks badly because they were so strict about encryption and about all this stuff, which now it seems totally normal, but at the time it seemed they thought it was completely paranoid and totally over the top how strict they were about trying to protect this data and trying to not let it go out into the world unredacted. So it's
And I think the point that you just raised about how the US State Department was helping with the redactions I guess can lead us on to a very good point of, I think the main thing that came out of yesterday was that the US prosecution, or the indictment, the case was made by the defense that it's willfully misconstrues the facts of the case, and that is a very good example of that. Is that WikiLeaks were actually State Department was helping WikiLeaks in the redaction, so to kind of make the claim that WikiLeaks is recklessly putting lives at risk is knowingly untrue because they're involved in that process.
And the government's argument was that you can't talk about that. You just have to look at what's in the extradition request. Don't even look at the indictment, just what's in the extradition request, the way it's phrased. And so really trying to limit what the judge can look at in this case and try to really narrow it, make that decision harder for her.
And I found sometimes almost rude the way the prosecution was telling the judge, this is not your jurisdiction. All you have to decide on is what, basically saying all of this is none of your business. You have, nothing to say on all this. Leave that up to us. He'll have a fair trial in America. All you need to decide is whether or not he can be extradited, and ignore all,
right.
all this.
All they
evidence.
want them to look at is what's called dual criminality. If it's a crime in the U.S., is it also a crime in the UK? That's all they want them to look at. But what the defense is arguing is that it so misrepresents the facts, that it so misconstrues things as to constitute an abuse of process. And so that's the way that they're challenging this extradition so far.
Sorry.
Well, and then from that, what extends is they're making the argument that Julian Assange is in Belmarsh prison, denied bail, and so he's arbitrarily detained, and his rights, his due process rights, are being violated because you have put forward an indictment that is false, improper, and plays fast and loose with the facts, and in doing so, only because you're doing that, are you able to justify keeping him in prison? Only by doing that are you able to convince the judge that Julian Assange should be in prison, not out on bail, and so without that, this has been really why we're trapped in this kind of a case.
I think one thing that may be important to clarify here is who has the burden to show evidence, like what side does. I'm not sure if the standard is proof, but is it up to the defense to show that this extradition should not happen?
Well, so the defense framed it as they're bringing an abuse of process allegation against this request. So they're saying that the judge should decide on whether the request itself is abusive in its nature by misrepresenting the facts. There are several factors, but one of them is how willfully it misrepresents the facts. So it's framed as, and actually that's interesting, the judge asked, like, what do you want me to rule on here early on in the court? And one of the things was whether this is an abuse of process.
And I guess one thing that was relevant to that was lost my point there, but the one of the things that came out about the abuse of process was, I'm completely losing my point here. You're gonna have to.
I could go back to.
Maybe if you could, yeah. Why don't you pick it up?
I just want to say something about that you mentioned earlier that I think should get a lot more attention, is that we never get focus on what WikiLeaks disclosed on the war crimes. And I was so glad that yesterday we actually heard about collateral murder as a war crime, and the defense described it as a genuinely chilling video. And we finally, I mean, this isn't the proper way, they should be doing it in The Hague, but finally we get U.S. war crimes mentioned in a courtroom here. And so, as Kevin was saying, it's amazing how the government wants to paint Assange as just the coach who used Chelsea Manning as a pawn, basically completely denying her whistleblowing agency when
structured their statements to the court, they're reminding or perhaps informing the judge for the first time. We don't know. I don't know what kind of knowledge she has of WikiLeaks disclosures and publications and the kind of impact it had on the world.
agency when
structured their statements to the court, they're reminding or perhaps informing the judge for the first time. We don't know. I don't know what kind of knowledge she has of WikiLeaks disclosures and publications and the kind of impact it had on the world.
blowing agency when
Structured their statements to the court, they're reminding or perhaps informing the judge for the first time. We don't know. I don't know what kind of knowledge she has of WikiLeaks disclosures and publications and the kind of impact it had on the world.